How's it going, everybody? Pitela here with RedefineFX, and today I want to share a bunch of tyFlow tips and tricks. We're going to start with the super easy ones. So once you have a tyFlow in your scene, you can just click on New up here to make a whole new tyFlow. And when you create a new tyFlow separately, it will also show up here. You can easily disable and enable your tyFlow with this button or refresh the simulation. If you're tired of scrolling through the settings, you can just right-click, Layout, 2 roll-up columns, and your settings will show up in 2 columns. You can also right-click, Layout, and show the operators vertically like this. If you get tired of looking for the operator you need, you can just hit Tab on your keyboard and type what you're looking for. So maybe particle bind, double-click, and here it is. If you need to apply a random material to your particles, but you don't feel like creating a multi-sub-object material manually, you can just right-click, Utilities, and say assign randomized multicolor material, and then just add a material ID operator on top, set it to random, and here you go. Each particle has a different material. You may not know that tyFlow comes with 5 useful presets. So we have simple icon flow, which looks like this, IV flow, which creates some IV on your geometry, object flow, a simple physics simulation flow, and there's also a preset for scattering objects, which looks like this. You can easily create trails behind your particles just by adding the spline pass operator. Just click on create new, and now you're creating trails behind your particles. You can easily duplicate an operator just by holding shift and dragging. You can also right click, say copy, and then paste instanced. And this way you will be changing the settings for both of them at the same time. And if you don't want to do that anymore, you can just right click and make unique. So now there are 2 separate operators again. When you have a bunch of tyFlows in your scene and you're confused by which one is which, you can just go into the main tyFlow settings and say show name. And you can also change their color just like for any 3ds Max object. So now they're much easier to differentiate. You may not know that inside of the shape operator there are a bunch of cool objects such as these nice looking bolts, screws, random chunks which are great for dirt, some random broken glass pieces, and much more, so definitely look around. When you want to create a burst of 10 particles that lasts 5 frames and repeats every 20 frames, you can just enable the repeater, set the count to 10, the duration to 5, and the frames to 20, and then every 20 frames you're giving birth to 10 particles and they're being born across 5 frames, just like this. By default, tyFlow will not import the materials, but what you can do under birth objects is just go under instance material and say inherit from object, and it will grab the materials during rendering and show up correctly in your render. Which reminds me that you have to add a mesh operator in order for your tyFlow particles to show up in your renderer. If you don't add a mesh operator, there will be nothing here. You can place your particles just on your desired material ID by going into the position object operator, enabling density by material ID, and just setting the number to what you want. And here they are. If you want to avoid particles going through each other, you can just add the fuse operator and increase the radius until you get rid of any intersections. On the same note, if you don't like how the particles are placed, you can go into position object and enable separation and then play with the separation distance so you can spread them out nicely and evenly. And if you just want to change the pattern in which they're placed, you can always just right click on the position object and say reseat selected. And this works for many operators with tyFlow that have any kind of settings. You can always right click and reseat selected to get a slightly different result. You can scale particles down over time just by adding another scale operator, setting the timing to continuous, the type to absolute, the amount to 0, and then set the interpolation to less than 1. So I'll do 0.1 and they will slowly disappear into nothing. If you want to make particles smaller, if they're close to a certain object, you can just enable scale by proximity, pick the object, set the scale to less than 100%, so maybe 50, and then you can click invert and set the distance to maybe just 50 centimeters. And now all the spheres will get small depending on how close they are to the object I'm moving around. You can easily add thickness to your cloth simulations just by scrolling down in the cloth bind operator and saying add shell to surface. And then you can modify the amounts and get some nice thick cloth that way. And while you're here, you can also enable the outer, inner, and edge material IDs to get this kind of a result depending on the material IDs of the cloth. You can easily fracture an object by its polygons just by adding the face fracture operator, setting the faces to 1 and variation to 0, and make sure you set it to polygons, not triangles. Then maybe add a spin operator to slowly spin them randomly. And don't forget that a lot of the 3ds Max modifiers exist as operators inside of tyFlow, so you can easily just add a shell operator to give these pieces a little bit of thickness. And if you have a material applied to your tyFlow and you just want to get rid of it, you can right click utilities and say remove material, and it will get rid of it and go back to default. You can of course fracture objects with the Voronoi fracture operator, maybe give it 500 points. You can scroll down and increase the slice plane separation to create some nice gaps between the individual fractures. And then of course you can just put a material ID operator on top, set it to random. And this is basically the thumbnail artwork for this video. If you wanted to connect these pieces, you could add a physics shape and a physics bind, say show bindings, then add our spline paths, create new, and set it to physics bindings. Click on this icon to show it in viewport. Inside of the tySpline mesher, you can lower their radius, and maybe in the physics bind you can create more connections. And here you go. You can easily add a shockwave force with the point force operator. Just set the push value to maybe 100, give it some spin and some variation, and here you go. You have some shockwaves being created wherever the particles are being born. If you want to place your particles based on a texture, you can just copy the texture, then go into your position object operator, scroll down to density by texture, and just paste instance. Here you go. On the same note, if I want the particles inside of the logo to be bigger, I can just add a scale operator, text map, multiply by text map, and paste my map in here as instance. Then you need to pick the object that the texture is on, so I'll just pick the plane. And right now the particles are 0% where it's white and 100% where it's black. So you can just set the effect value to maybe 50%. And then you can play with the scale, maybe set it to 150. And now the particles are big wherever the logo is. And finally, if you want the particles to take on the material based on the texture, just apply the texture material straight to tyFlow and then add a mapping operator. And for the mapping object, just pick the plane with the texture. And here you go. The particles now have the material based on the texture. Alright, let me know in the comments if you found these helpful. I'd be happy to do a sequel with 30 more, 40 more, 50 more tips and tricks. Thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you on the next one.